So let's talk about Games Workshop's new fixed squad sizes for Warhammer 40K, and some of the weird ramifications for all this for both game purposes and model collections. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd just take a video to discuss one of the stranger changes to come out of 10th edition that was revealed when we had the points cost update last week. Basically, this video is talking about Games Workshop's more fixed squad sizes, meaning that as per the official rules, squad size kind of works similar to Age of Sigmar, and as per the official rules, you're generally going to be wanting to take squads in certain set numbers, as opposed to having full flexibility to pay just the points cost per model. Basically, the way that it works now, as per the new points cost system, is that you basically get fixed points costs, either for a squad of minimum size or maximum size most of the time. Some squads have an option somewhere in the middle, and some squads have no flexibility whatsoever, say for example the tactical squad that is just locked to 10 models now. This is very different to how it's been for Warhammer 40k in the past. Generally speaking, most units have generally had the option to buy in how many models they want, say for example paying say 20 points for an intercessor in days past, or 7 points for a Tyranid Termagant in 9th edition. Now they're listed as you see on the bottom right. Say for example if you were picking up some Adeptus Mechanicus Sicarian Infiltrators, 5 models would cost you 80 points, 10 models would cost you 160. If you filled anything in between, say 6, 7, 8 or 9 models, you're still going to be paying for the higher cost of up to 10. As per Games Workshop's official rules now, they've basically made it directly suboptimal to fill anything in the middle. In general, the logic seems to be that basically squads are just locked per multiples of the box set, and admittedly that does have some advantages, as we'll get onto in a second. Overall, the general sentiment that I've seen when talked about this is broadly a lot more negative than positive. I do think it's one of those changes that maybe isn't exactly the end of the world for Warhammer 40k, not something that I'm going to get so upset about that I don't play 10th edition or anything like that. I'm sure we'll get used to the new way of doing things, but I feel like it just broadly seems like a somewhat unhelpful change for numerous different reasons. I did a channel post to ask about people's general opinions to this. The polling was 44% of people dislike, 37% of people were neutral, and 19% of people like the change. Means that around about 50% actually dislike it, and of the rest, most people just don't really care that much. Only a few people really think it's all that positive. There's definitely lots of different takes that you can make about this. I thought we'd talk through some of the positive and negative ramifications of it in this video, but I must admit one of the first things that stood out to a lot of people is this kind of feels like going back to power level for Warhammer 40k, losing a whole lot of granularity between different sized squads, and also going hand in hand with the massive free war gear handout. Between the two you basically have a system that kind of looks like power level, though admittedly the actual squad cost can be a little bit more nuanced than that system was, as that was just very blocky in terms of points chunks of 20. It is kind of funny that was broadly applauded when it went away. Similar polling had very few people missing power level at all, but then it does look like the new point system is a lot closer to power level than people might have expected perhaps. First up, we'll talk through the positives of the change. I do think that there are some, though I must admit personally I feel like they're probably outweighed by the negatives that we'll get onto. First up, admittedly it is a bit simpler. 10th edition seems to be all about removing as many barriers to complexity to newer players joining the hobby, and admittedly just having 2 choices of points costs for a lot of units really is quite obvious and simple for new players jumping in, though it is a bit debatable by just how much simpler it really is. Paying a points cost per model I don't think was the hardest thing in the world either. For a fair few squads it maybe forces them into slightly more fluffy choices. Say for example Space Marine tactical squads, they're just 10 models now. Classically that does tend to be how they're fielded, even if they could combat squad in the past. Means that you have a few less odd sized squads floating around, though admittedly it doesn't work for everyone, as anyone who's got their berserkers fielded in squads of 8 or Plague Marines fielded in squads of 7 will tell you. Broadly speaking, I feel like having the squad size made to reflect the box is kind of handy to new players as well. I think Games Workshop's game design has generally reflected around if you buy the box then hopefully you should have the optimal way to fill the unit right out of the box without having to do weird things like pick up multiple sets for odd numbers or individual bits of war gear elsewhere. By making it so the only optimal ways to field a unit are in multiples of the box set, you kind of get the optimal loadout pretty much guaranteed out of one box of miniatures picked up, and it might mean that there's less pressure to acquire models from other random sources if say you had a unit that was really good if you got to 8 models in strength, rather than say 5 or 10 which you might be able to buy them in multiples of. I did kind of suspect that the rumours of this sort of thing might be true judging by the new blast keyword rules. The blast keyword basically punishes units for being fielded in squads of 5 or squads of 10, so if you didn't have sort of locked rules like this it might be optimal to field squads in say 9s or 19s, which might have been a bit weird and arbitrary. I guess having the locked squad sizes does mean that there'll be less gaming of that, and trying to avoid blast penalties by fielding one under the main number, perhaps in a similar sort of way to how coherency worked, and you often didn't want to field 6 model squads in 9th edition. Finally, I think it's also worth bearing in mind that if you really want to and you're playing with a bunch of like-minded friends, you could just literally just stick to the old system and pay the points cost per model. It's usually very easy to work out how many points each model is going to be, or at least roughly. Say for example, for those Sicarian infiltrators in the previous example, there's 5 of them for 80 points, 10 of them for 160, it's basically 16 points per model there. It doesn't mean that for more casual games, and say for newer players who might have got random odd collections of models from somewhere, you could still basically just tailor the points cost to fit the unit that you can actually take. In casual play, the rules can be bent and broken where it makes sense. It does require a group of like-minded people though. For random pickup games you might get questions about that. I'd say the motivation for doing that should probably be to just allow people to field their collections, as opposed to going for any sort of game-breaking combos to get massively stronger rules. If you're trying to put clever combos together, you should probably just stick to the official rules for it. So there's a rundown of a few of the positives, at least in my mind. Now let's get through to some of the issues that it causes. First up, I would argue that the simplicity gains that this brings are kind of minimal. I feel like most players didn't really have much problem with X points per model. You're still probably going to need a calculator or a list building app to actually add up the points cost of a Warhammer 40K army. There's just too many numbers not to have that sort of thing going. And if that's happening, then adding up individual points of each miniature per squad isn't exactly the worst, particularly if war gear stays free as well. Say for the Virtus Praetors, it'd just be 90 points per model. Easy enough to calculate, really. There might also be a little bit of cause for confusion for super new players between the datasheets and the points costs. Lots of squads are still listed, basically say 5 to 10 Chaos Space Marines, implying that you can take any number in between. Yet the points costs don't actually reflect that, and they basically just say 5 or 10, and you're not allowed to have anything in between on those sets of rules. A couple of niche examples got a little bit more complicated as well. Say for example the Virtus Praetors, which can weirdly be fielded in any combination of models except for 4. That's due to the option of one of the squad being able to be fielded as a shield captain on jetbike, so they have to account for players building one of the models as a shield captain and the rest of the units being fielded as regular jetbikes. That's definitely cherry picking a bad example, so maybe isn't entirely fair, but definitely looks like an example of something that would have been far easier to just say 90 points per model, 2 to 6 of them. One of the other biggest weird things for squad sizes fixed are the headaches that it can cause with transports. For the most part in 10th edition, Games Workshop has done kind of well to de-restrict a bunch of transports, say giving them an extra slot or two for characters to attach to their units, and it does work very well for certain squads, but maybe just struggles a little bit more with certain other units. Space Marines are perhaps one of the biggest examples, given that they've got really quite a lot of transports and a lot of different units that might be fielded in different squad sizes, often with or without characters attached. Drop pods are kind of unfortunate in that rules as written, if you're going to be fielding a character and your unit dropping in, you now basically have to pay the points for the 10th model in the squad, and then basically just not take him and pay the points for the character instead. Means that units like that are unlikely to be all that efficient unless you're getting an absolutely massive boost for the character and you desperately do need them in the unit. Impulsors are perhaps another bad example as well. Work kind of fine for the 5 model squads, things like Hellblasters, maybe with an attached character there. The issues for them are with the Space Marine units that you can field in squads of 6, say specifically the Blade Guard veterans, who you definitely might want 6 of them in an impulsor to get them close to the enemy. If you then attach a character to the units, then they won't fit in the transport anymore, as there's only 6 slots. I feel like it might have been an idea to make the impulsors transport 7 for that reason. Otherwise, Razorbacks don't work with tactical squads now, and they lack the splitter unit rule that Games Workshop thought to include for Sagittors, Venoms, and Immolators. Would have been nice to allow them to field half a tactical squad and the other squad be elsewhere. The Stormwolf gunship doesn't really work well with Terminators, as it transports 8 of them but not 10. 6 Death Shroud Terminators in a Death Guard Land Raider can't take any character support, despite being a unit that really wants to. Overall, there do seem to be really quite a lot of examples of this just working kind of badly. I can't help but think that maybe an easier solution to Games Workshop's character woes might have just been to have characters not take up a slot in the transport. It might be a bit of an abstraction, but it's probably better off compared with having units that either can or can't be fielded with characters due to how many slots there are in the tank. Next up, perhaps one of the most surprising things to see was that Games Workshop's system doesn't seem to always reflect the box, perhaps the most obvious one being the Plague Marines that just don't really seem to have been considered. They're sold in box sets of 7, yet the squad size that you pay for in points is either 5 or 10. That seems super dumb, and it means that you just basically can't really field a full Plague Marine unit unless you take 2 of these, or you pick up that reinforcements kit or something. I genuinely wouldn't be too surprised if they decide to change this at some point. Feels like it was probably just an oversight. I feel like out of any of the units that should get a middling points value, the Death Guard Plague Marines absolutely should. The Custodian Wardens are another example as well. 5 models in the box, yet their squad size is strangely 3 to 6. Just a bit of an odd decision there. Not sure what the logic behind that one was. It also doesn't really take into account for any BAS box sets either, or any individual models they acquired from elsewhere, such as Games Workshop's free models of the month from Warhammer stores. Means that if you want to include them in squads now, the points cost just wouldn't really be very friendly to that unless you manage to acquire a full 10 to get to the next bracket or something like that. Another small issue with the system is that army lists are really quite a lot harder to finish than they used to be now. Generally when you're building an army list, you keep on adding units in bit by bit until you hit the unit cap, whether it's 1000, 2000 or 3000. For quite a lot of armies in 40k with the free war gear changes that they've had throughout 9th edition, finishing armies could be a little bit more fiddly now, even at the best of times. Imperial and Chaos Knights seem to be perhaps a particularly good example of that. It does feel that quite a lot of armies in the game are now going to have a similar sort of problem to the Knights though. Both fixed squads and free war gear kind of combine to mean that you've almost got no units that you can just add in a few extra points to. And quite a lot of armies have had their smallest units raised in points as well, so you might only be able to include things that are say 50 points or more. Could just make it very awkward if you have somewhere around 20 to 40 points left. Do you take out one of your units that you wanted to fit in 2 smaller ones, or do you buy in an enhancement for a character that really isn't needed and you didn't really want in the first place? I guess they could be useful enough to fill up a few points gaps. Again though, I felt it was just a lot easier when you had either the option to give one squad a slightly fancier gun, or just to take a few more models in a Horde type unit perhaps. Could just make finishing up some lists super easy. Otherwise, digging through for other examples of weirdness, I feel like some units with more powerful models in one half of the squad have perhaps been handled better than others. For things like the Space Marine Devastators, they have actually put some good thought into it, which I think have been done very well. The first 5 models are 120 points, as they're going to be the ones that you field the exciting heavy weapons on, a squad full of las cannons or something like that. And then if you include more models in the unit, you've already used up your heavy weapon allowance, so each of the others would only be an extra 16 points effectively. It's 80 points for the next 5. As it goes for this system, that does seem like a very good way of doing things, and might have actually been harder than the old system with just points per model. Doesn't seem like this has been applied to everything equally though. Maybe a bad example might be the Deathwatch veterans versus the Proteus kill team. The base squad is generally 5 veterans either way. The Deathwatch veterans pay 100 points for them, the Proteus kill team pays 165 points for those same 5 veterans, and then has to double the cost for the extra 5 models they're including in the unit, which I guess often might be Terminators at these kind of points costs. Weirdly, it means that even if you don't take Terminators, the Proteus team's paying a tax for presumably including them in the second 5, and it also means that the other specialists in the units probably aren't going to get quite as much of a look in. Vanguard veterans and bikers might bring some utility to the units, but they're definitely not going to be worth the same amount of points as putting a massive great big toughness 5 4+ invul Terminator on the board. With points cost for the individual models, I think they could have made them a lot more balanced. Otherwise, just for a few other things, I feel like just adapting from the one system to the other is going to be kind of painful for a few armies that aren't really established with the unit sizes that Games Workshop has in mind. Could be kind of nasty for older collections. For practicalities of collecting as well, it could be kind of irritating, say if you manage to lose one model in the squad, or just gain some extra models somewhere else from second hand or somewhere like that. There's a good chance they might not fit neatly into the 5 or 10 models that you need to field a unit. For fluff and flavour purposes, I feel like some units actually might be less fluffy if you lock them into neat 5s or 10s. Certainly the Cult Chaos Space Marines, like having 8 Khorne Berserkers, or 7 Plague Marines, or 6 Noise Marines, that's been a bit of a fluffy tradition for quite a while now. Plus it's just a bit odd for certain Horde style units to be locked into multiples of 5s as well. Mobs of things like Orc Boys or Chaos Cultists I just don't think would necessarily always regiment themselves, so having random numbers of those seems kind of completely fluffy to me. Finally, I think to some extent it's maybe just a little bit less enjoyable for customization's sake, and the fine-tuning of tweaking army lists and moving armies up and down by small increments, changing out things from one game to another. List building is definitely a fun aspect of 40k that a lot of people enjoy. It is still going to be interesting, but it's going to be a lot less focused on the fine details now, and more about the big choices between different units, I guess. I think at least a fair few people might not enjoy the slight lack of customization with tailoring their units exactly how they like them. Overall, as you can probably tell, I feel like I'm a bit more negative about this whole thing than positive. It's definitely not going to ruin my enjoyment of 10th edition or anything like that, but just feels like a slightly dumb change that didn't really need to happen. They still could have made the points super simple by just giving a simple cost per model, particularly if War Gear was free as well. That already gets rid of just about all the complexity already. There definitely are a few positives towards locking the squad size to box sets, and some gains in focusing the game rules for newer players, but I would say they're probably outweighed by the negatives in terms of transport weirdness, finishing army lists, and some squads and box sets just not really working very well, plus just practically for players' collections. Let me know your thoughts on it though. Do you like the change or dislike it? Look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k content coming. I do tend to post new things just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.